I want to be clear about something before I say anything else. I did not set out to bond with the Kessari. I did not study them, approach them on purpose, or make any kind of deliberate effort to establish the relationship that the Compact's territorial registry is now, describing in formal language I do not fully understand. What I did was sit outside the perimeter fence every evening because I needed quiet. I had nowhere else to go, and the inside of my quarters smelled like the previous tenant's boot oil in a way that never fully aired out. That is the full account of my intentions. Whatever the Kessari made of it is their own business, and if their formal documentation uses the phrase Threshold Watch Covenant, binding under Article 14 of the Compact's Territorial Provision Code, I would ask that it be noted for this inquiry board that I did not write that language and I would not have chosen those words. My name is Cam Severin. I am 36 years old. I held a Series 4 structural labor certification for off-world operations, and for the 2 years prior to the events in question, I was working a rigging rotation on the outer Corindal infrastructure grid, which is about as unglamorous as it sounds. Before that, I spent 9 months at Vethkar Station, which is the resettlement outpost in the outer Corindal corridor, where all of this started. I am here today because Administrator Harith has filed a formal objection to the Compact's territorial ruling, and I have been asked to give an account of how I came to be listed as the Sari Pac's registered anchor individual. I will do that to the best of my ability. I should also mention that I have read the documentation the Compact's territorial surveyors submitted, and I want the board to know that the section describing my evening habit as a deliberate behavioral anchor signal transmitted across consistent temporal intervals is, with respect, a significant overstatement. I sat outside. I did it every evening. I sat there because it was quiet and I was tired. There was no signal. There was no transmission. There was just me, a flat rock near the outer fence, and eventually 3 very large animals that apparently interpreted this as an invitation. I arrived Vethkar Station in the 2nd week of the 3rd month, 14 months before my outer Corindal contract started. Vethkar at that time was a mid-size resettlement outpost, maybe 400 civilians in prefab housing, a small admin block, a supply depot, and a perimeter fence that was more symbolic than functional. The Corindal corridor gets cold at night, and the perimeter fence was chain-link rated for moderate fauna. Nobody had told whoever designed it about the Kessari. I had been hired as part of the structural survey team, which meant I spent my days crawling around the outpost's prefab modules checking load, tolerances, and making sure the expansion bolts hadn't worked loose in the freeze-thaw cycling. It was precise, slow indoor work, and I have always found precise, slow indoor work extremely exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with the physical effort. The focus required is the kind that burns itself back out and leaves nothing useful behind when the shift ends. By the time evening came, I needed to be outside with nothing around me, and so I started going to the outer perimeter after dinner. The first time I found the flat rock, it was just a broad piece of native stone that had been pushed to the edge of the cleared zone when they graded the outpost's footprint, not comfortable exactly, but solid and warm enough to sit on. I sat on it and watched the tree line go dark. The Corindal corridor has long dusk. The light comes off in layers, first the hard white, then amber, then this deep greenish-gray before full dark, and on a clear evening you can see 3 of the 4 visible stars in the outer reach cluster before the sky goes properly black. I had been to enough off-world postings to know that visible star evenings were worth sitting for. I sat there for about 40 minutes, watching the tree line settle into shadow and the stars take their places one by one. And when I got up and went back inside, I slept better than I had in weeks. I did it again the next evening, and the one after that. It became a habit inside 2 weeks piece, the way habits do when you are in a new place, and something small provides the only reliable comfort available. I did not think of it as significant. I did not tell anyone I was doing it. I just went out to the flat rock after dinner, sat for 40 minutes, watched the light go, and came back in. The Kessari appeared on the 14th day. I did not know what they were when I first saw them. I knew the Corindal corridor had large native fauna. The briefing materials mentioned it in the standard 3rd paragraph, the one that always uses the phrase exercise appropriate caution, without specifying what appropriate means or what you are supposed to do when your caution turns out to be insufficient. The briefing did not describe the Kessari in any detail I can remember, and even if it had, the 3 animals that came out of the tree line at dusk on my 14th evening were sub-adult, which meant they were substantially smaller than they would later become, and at that size they looked like nothing so much as very large. Slate-gray bears with the posture of something that had been engineered rather than evolved. Dense fur, broad paw pads that touched the ground without sound, and pale amber eyes that caught the last of the amber stage light and held it. They were 40 meters out when I first saw them, then 30. They were moving slowly, with that low head, measuring quality. That means an animal is gathering information about something, rather than approaching it as a threat. I watched them. They watched me. I did not get up, primarily because I had learned a long time ago that the animals most likely to hurt you are the ones you run from, and secondarily because they had fanned out slightly, one on each flank, one center, in a way that suggested that running was not going to be a productive option regardless. We looked at each other for what I would estimate was 4 minutes. Then the center one sat down, not crouched, not coiled, sat, with its broad haunches settled and its pale amber eyes level and its breathing easy. It looked at me the way you look at something you have already decided about. The 2 flanking ones did not sit, but they eased. The slight shift in posture that means a thing has stopped being ready and started being present. And after another minute, one of them took 3 steps toward me and stopped again. I said, "Easy," not as a command, as a formality, the way you would say it to a stranger who's too close on a crowded transit platform. Just, "Easy. I hear you, I see you, no issue." The one that had stepped forward sat down too. I stayed for the rest of my usual 40 minutes. When I got up to go back in, they were still there. I said, "Good night," which I acknowledge was an absurd thing to say, and went inside. I reported the encounter to the station's operations log the next morning as required. I noted, 3 subadult Kessari, outer perimeter zone, east fence line, non-aggressive posture, no contact. I did not mention sitting with them for 40 minutes because that felt like information that would generate questions I did not have good answers to. They were there again the next evening, all 3. I sat on the flat rock. They settled about 20 meters out. We did the same thing we had done the night before, which was nothing, together, for 40 minutes. When I left, the center one, the largest of the 3, heaviest through the shoulders, a slightly darker stripe along the spine, got up and took a few steps after me before stopping at some invisible line I had not seen, but apparently it had. I stopped too. We looked at each other. I said tomorrow and went inside. I am aware this sounds like anthropomorphization and possibly mild insanity. I want the inquiry board to know that at the time it did not feel like either. It felt like the most reasonable exchange I had had since arriving at Vethkar. By the 3rd week I had given them names, which I also did not report to the operations log. The heaviest one, the one that sometimes took a few steps toward me when I left, I called Vaughn. The one on the usual left flank, slightly leaner, with a habit of sitting at a 3/4 angle so it could watch both me and the tree line, simultaneously, I called Thresh. The smallest of the 3, subadult smallest, which still meant something approaching the size of a large cargo crate when it was standing. I called Moret, because it had a way of tilting its head when I talked that reminded me of someone I had once worked a survey contract with, and whose name was also Moret, and who had the same quality of paying careful, skeptical attention. I talked to them sometimes, not constantly, and not in the way you would talk to a domestic animal. No high-pitched register, no simpering vocabulary. Just conversation the way I might have it with a colleague while we were both doing something else. I told them about the expansion bolt situation in Module 7. I told them about the bad freeze-thaw seal in the eastern prefab corridor. I told them about a job I had done on a transit hub 2 postings ago, where the load-bearing specifications had been miscalculated by a factor of 3 and nobody had noticed until a senior engineer sat in the wrong chair and heard the floor creak in a way floors should not creak. They listened, or appeared to. They did not offer suggestions, which I found appropriate. I found that the talking was useful to me regardless of whether it was useful to them. The shift from indoor precision work to outdoor quiet speech is a particular kind of release. You take the pressure of the day's focus and let it out in a medium that requires nothing back from you. The Kessari were ideal for this because they were attentive without being demanding. They did not have opinions about Module 7's expansion bolts. They did not interrupt. They did not look at their communicators while I was talking. I have worked with human colleagues who could not claim the same. The station security team became aware of the situation around the 4th week, not through my operations log entry, which I gather they had not read, but because one of the perimeter camera operators noticed 3 large shapes at the east fence line at dusk on 3 consecutive evenings and flagged it to the security supervisor, a man named Drival who had a dedicated manner and the kind of face that suggests someone has been serious about their work since childhood. Drival came to find on a Tuesday morning. He asked whether I had been going out to the perimeter at night. I said yes. He asked whether I was aware that there were Kessari subadults frequenting the east fence line. I said yes. He looked at me for a moment, the way people look when they are deciding whether to say the thing that is actually on their minds or the thing that is professionally appropriate. Then he said, "They're Kessari, Mr. Severin." I said I understood that. He said, "Subadults can weigh up to 800 kilograms. I said I was aware of that. He said, "The east fence is not rated for Kessari." I said that I knew. He said, "Are you going to stop going out there?" I thought about it. I said, "No." Drival was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to need to note this in my watch log, and I'm going to ask that you carry a standard distress signal when you go out." I said that seemed reasonable, and I did start carrying one, though I never used it. The Kessari did not cross the fence. I want to be clear about that. In 9 months of evening visits, they came to the fence line exactly twice, and both times they stopped at the outside of it, sat, and waited for me to come to them. The first time was around the 6th week, when Vaughn, I had not told Drival the names. I felt this information would not be helpful to him, sat at the fence line for about 15 minutes before I came out, and when I walked up to the fence he pressed his nose briefly to the chain link. He was warm. I had not expected warmth. He smelled like earth and something faintly mineral, the way very large animals often do, and his breath misted in the cold evening air and hung there for a moment before dispersing. I said, "Evening," and he backed off and sat down. That was the night I met Sular. Sular was there at the tree line that evening, sitting at about 60 meters, and I had not seen him before. He was older than the other 3, old enough that his fur had gone partly silver-gray along the muzzle and across the broad flat of his shoulders, and substantially larger, though he moved with the easy, unhurried quality of something that has nothing to prove. He did not come to the fence. He sat at 60 meters and looked at me and the 3 subadults, with the attentive stillness of an individual observing something that is going as it should, not supervising exactly. More the quality of a thing that has been watching something develop for some time and has come to a conclusion about it. I nodded at him. He did not nod back because he was a Kessari, but he held still for a moment and then lay down, which I interpreted as relaxation in the same way I would interpret it from a person. After that, Sular was present most evenings, though always at the tree line rather than the fence. He seemed to be holding a different kind of position. An anchor point, I thought of it, the way a foreman holds back from a job rather than working it directly. The subadults clustered near the fence. Sular held the distance. It felt, though I would not have used this word at the time, coordinated. Drival, to his credit, handled the situation professionally throughout. He updated the perimeter protocols to note that the east fence line from coordinates B7 through C12 was a designated wildlife adjacency zone during dusk hours, which meant that no one else from the station was supposed to go out there. I think he meant this partly for my safety, and partly because he had correctly identified that additional people in the perimeter zone would complicate things in ways that were difficult to predict. Other people have a tendency to react to the size, to the amber eyes, to the low-grade chest vibration the Kessari produce when they are settled and at ease, which is felt more than heard, and which several of the camera operators had described as unnerving. The result was that my 40-minute evening sessions with the Kessari remained entirely private, except for the camera operators, who, I am told, stopped reporting the sightings after the 2nd week, because they had confirmed the subadults were not attempting to breach the fence, and they had run out of useful things to say about it. Months passed. The subadults grew, not in the sudden way of adolescent animals, but in the slow, continuous way that means you stop noticing, and then one day you look and realize something has happened. By month 4, Vaughn had reached a size where the chain-link fence looked genuinely inadequate beside him, the way a garden gate looks inadequate beside a transport hauler. By month 6, Thresh had developed a habit of scanning the perimeter in both directions before settling, a deliberate, methodical 2-point check that stopped looking like animal behavior and started looking like someone executing a procedure. Moret had gotten broad, not tall but solid, with the thick-barreled chest that I was eventually told meant the Kessari had reached their secondary growth stage. which is apparently when they transition from subadult to what the territorial documentation later described as full territorial cohort members. In month 7, I noticed something else. The formation had become consistent. Vaughn always took the center position closest to the fence. Thresh always took the left flank at a distance of roughly 20 meters. Marit always took the right at the same distance. Suler always held the tree line, approximately 60 meters back, slightly left of center. It was not random settling. It was the same configuration every single night, to within a few meters. I noticed it the way you notice the arrangement of familiar objects when one of them has moved, which is to say I noticed it by the absence of variation. Once I had seen it, I could not unsee it. They were not wandering up to the fence to see what I was doing. They were taking positions. I mentioned this to Draval in passing. Not as a security concern, but as an observation, I said. They've settled into a consistent formation, same positions every night. He asked me to describe it, and I did, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said he would note it in the watch log. He did not express alarm. I think by month 7, Draval had completed whatever internal assessment process he had been running about the Kessari, and had arrived at a stable conclusion, which was that they were not going to breach the fence, they were not going to harm anyone on the station, and the situation was going to continue as long as I was at Vethkar, and possibly after. He seemed to have made his peace with this. I respected him for it. Month 8 brought the first heavy Corondal snowfall, which comes early in the corridor and stays late. I wondered whether the Kessari would adjust the timing or abandon the evening sessions during the weather. They did not. I went out to the flat rock in the snow on the first night of the snowfall, and they were already at the fence when I got there. Vaughn's broad shoulders carrying about 2 centimeters of snow like a plank carries it, Thresh and Marit white-dusted across their backs. Suler, at the tree line barely visible in the dark and the snowfall, just the amber eyes and the occasional pale pulse of breath. The snow didn't seem to inconvenience them. It certainly didn't stop them. I started wearing a better coat. By month 9, the sessions had a quality I can only describe as settled. Not routine in the way of something you do out of obligation, but routine in the way of something you do because it is simply part of the shape of the day. I would finish my survey work. I would eat dinner. I would go to the flat rock. They would be there. 40 minutes, and then I would go back in and sleep well. And in the morning I would do the work again. It was the most structurally coherent thing in my life at that point. I think this says something about my life, but I am not certain what. I did not tell Draval about the formation. I told myself this was because I lacked the technical vocabulary to describe it accurately, which was true. I also lacked the willingness to have a conversation I couldn't finish cleanly, which was also true. Suler came every evening by month 5, reliable and consistent as a tide. He did not come to the fence. He held the tree line, sat, watched. Occasionally he vocalized, a low, chest-resonant sound that the Compact's wildlife documentation describes as a pack cohesion pulse, which is a phrase I did not know at the time, and would not have found useful if I had. I just knew it as the sound that meant he was there, and that things were, in his assessment, in order. I am going to say something now that I have been trying to work out how to say since I was asked to give this testimony. The thing about those evenings is that they were very simple. I would go out to the flat rock, sit down, watch the light go in layers off the Corondal sky. The Kessari would be there, or come to be there. One sometimes press against the fence, and I would put my hand on the chain link, and his warmth would come through the metal. Thresh would do her directional scans, and then settle into her left flank position. Marit would tilt her head at whatever I was saying. Suler would anchor the tree line. There was nothing complicated about it. There was nothing that required interpretation. I was tired and I needed quiet, and the Kessari were quiet, and they seemed to find the arrangement satisfactory for their own reasons which I was not qualified to assess. I was not the pack's handler. I was not their trainer or their keeper or their supervisor. I want to be clear about that for the record. They were not domesticated. They were not tame in any sense of the word. I know what tame looks like, and the Kessari were not it. Tame animals have a certain quality of suspension. They are paused from what they would otherwise be, restrained from it by familiarity and repetition. The Kessari were not paused from anything. They were exactly what they were, all of it, and the full scope of what they were was pointed in a direction that happened to include me. That is a different thing. It is a meaningfully different thing, and I think the board should understand the distinction before it considers what happened at the East Gate. What I mean is, Vaughn could have gone through that fence any night he wanted to. By month 7, he could have walked through it the way I walk through a doorway. He chose not to. I did not train that choice into him. He made it for reasons I cannot access and cannot explain, and he maintained it every single evening for the entire 9 months I was at Vethkar. And he maintained it for the 2 years after I left, which is a fact I find more difficult to think about than I expected. My outer Corundal contract started in month 9. I had known it was coming, and I had not given much thought to what the transition would mean for the evening sessions, because I had been trying not to think about it, and because I am not naturally inclined towards sentimentality, and I told myself they were animals and they would find somewhere else to be. The morning of my departure, I was loading my gear into the transit vehicle when Draval came to find me in the yard. He had the look of a man who needed to deliver information he considered professionally sensitive. He said, "The Kessari were at the fence this morning," I said. "They don't usually come in the mornings," he said. "No, all 4 of them." I looked at the transit vehicle. I looked at my bag. I said, "I don't have a good solution for that." Draval said, "I know. I just thought you should know they were there." I went out to the east fence line before the vehicle left. It was morning and the light was flat and cold and wrong for the kind of conversation I was used to having with them, which was no kind of conversation at all but which had a quality to it that morning light does not produce. All 4 of them were at the fence. Vaughn was standing close enough that I could see the individual hairs of his outer coat from 2 meters away. Thresh was in her directional scan posture, but both directions kept coming back to me. Marit was sitting, head tilted. Suler was behind them, not at the tree line, closer than he usually came, standing with that complete, unhurried stillness of his. I stood at the fence for a while. Vaughn put his nose to the chain link, and I put my hand there, and it was warm the way it always was, and I could feel his breath against my fingers. I said, "I'll be back." I do not know why I said it. I did not have a fixed return date. The outer Corundal contract was 2 years with a Sindert's extension option, which could push it to 30 months. I said it because it was true in some technical sense, and because I could not think of anything better to say to an animal that was going to sit it, an empty fence for however long it decided to wait. Then I got into the transit vehicle and left. The outer Corundal infrastructure grid is not a posting that gives you a great deal of time to think about things left behind. The work is physical and the shifts are long and the accommodations are functional in the same way that a very basic tool is functional. They accomplish what they need to accomplish and no more. The grid itself is a network of access corridors and atmospheric regulators spanning about 40 kilometers of the outer sector's established zone, and keeping it maintained means moving through it on a regular circuit, checking load points and splice connections and seal integrity, and replacing what needs replacing before it fails. It is important work in the way that plumbing is important. You notice it only when something goes wrong. I thought about Vethkar sometimes, the way you think about a place that had a particular quality you did not fully appreciate while you were there. I thought about the flat rock and the layered dusk and the sound Suler made from the tree line. I thought about Vaughn's warmth through the chain link, and Marit's skeptical head tilt, and Thresh checking both directions before she settled. I did not tell anyone about it. It was not the kind of thing that translated well into explanation, and the people I worked with on the outer Corundal grid were practical, focused individuals who had their own private things they did not translate into explanation. There was one evening on the grid, about 5 months in, when I finished a long exterior circuit run and came back to the staging depot at dusk. The outer Corundal sky does not do what the Corundal corridor sky does. It is a different latitude, different atmospheric composition. The dusk is flatter and faster with less of the layered quality I had gotten used to. I sat outside the staging depot on the equipment step for about 15 minutes anyway, watching the sky do its inferior version of the thing, and I noticed I had oriented myself slightly to face east. And I noticed my hands were in the same loose position on my knees that they always were, on the flat rock, and I noticed I was quiet in the way I got quiet at the fence line. I was performing without the Kessari, the habit that the Kessari had been performing without me. I thought about that for a while, and then I went inside and did not think about it directly again for several months. But it was there in the back of it, the way inconvenient things often are. Month 8 on the grid was when the commissioning inspection came through. This is a routine process. External engineers reviewing the circuit's maintenance logs and load records and verifying that the splice connections are within tolerance. I spent 3 days walking the inspection team through the eastern segments. The lead inspector was a methodical woman named Carol Veth, who had been doing commissioning inspections for about 20 years and who had a quality of attention that reminded me faintly of Thresh. The same deliberate two-point check, the same settling into a focused stillness once she had verified what she needed to verify. I did not tell her this. I thought it would be poorly received. On the last day of the inspection, Veth reviewed my maintenance logs and said they were among the cleanest she had seen on a long-haul circuit. She asked how long I had been doing this kind of work. I said about 12 years. She asked if I intended to stay on the grid. I said no. I had a posting I was going back to. She asked what kind. I said a resettlement outpost in the Corondal corridor. She said that seemed like a lateral move. I said it had advantages she wasn't aware of. She accepted this and signed off on the eastern segments without further commentary. I think about that conversation sometimes. The advantages she wasn't aware of were a flat rock and a view of 3 stars coming out in sequence, and 4 animals that had apparently decided, for reasons I cannot fully explain, that those 40 minutes in the evening were worth holding for 2 years in my absence. I am not sure Veth would have found this a satisfying answer. I find it more than satisfying. I find it, if I am being precise, one of the few things in my life that I do not need to qualify. I received in my 13th month on the outer Corondal grid a message from Drevel. This was not routine. Drevel had my contact details because he had entered them in the station's security log when the Kessari situation began, and in 9 months of evening visits he had never messaged me. I opened it with the particular attention you give to unexpected messages from people who do not contact you unless there is a reason. The message said, Administrator Harith had initiated a formal relocation assessment for the Kessari pack. The pack had been assessed as a Category 3 territorial risk under the Corondal Resettlement Authority's Wildlife Management Protocol, on the grounds that their behavior had become anomalous and unpredictable in the months following the departure of the quoted anchor individual. The assessment recommended specialist relocation to a designated Kessari reserve in the outer sector. 2 relocation specialists had been dispatched. They had arrived at Vethkar, reviewed the pack, and declined to proceed with the relocation. Their report, which Drevel had attached, stated that the Kessari pack had filed a compact territorial claim on the Vethkar station outer perimeter zone under Article 14 of the Compact's Territorial Provision Code, citing the pack's continuous occupancy of the zone and the existence of an established behavioral anchor covenant with a named individual. The named individual was me. The Compact's territorial claim was under review. The relocation could not proceed while the review was active. Drevel's message ended. I thought you should know. Also, they are still at the fence every evening. I read this message several times, then I sent Bask. Thank you. I'll be there in 11 months. What happened at Vethkar in those 11 months, I know only from the formal documentation that was later submitted to this inquiry and from conversations I had after the fact with Drevel and with a compact territorial surveyor named Osel, who had a kind manner and a patient way of explaining things to someone who had not previously encountered the phrase Anchor Covenant Behavioral Register. The short version is this. Administrator Harith did not accept the Compact's review determination easily. He had taken the position that the Kessari represented a liability for the resettlement outpost. Their size alone was enough to alarm new arrivals, and their habit of sitting at the east fence line during dusk hours had become visible to anyone on the eastern housing modules, which was a substantial portion of the population. New settlers would look out their windows at dusk and see 4 enormous animals holding positions at the perimeter. The adult Kessari, particularly Vaughn, had grown to a scale that required a specific effort of will to look at without a reaction. Harath had received complaints. He had handled them professionally. He had filed the relocation assessment in good faith, or what he considered good faith, and he found the Compact's Article 14 intervention procedurally inconvenient in the way that a structural engineer finds an inconvenient load calculation, not surprising but genuinely problematic for the plan he already had. He appealed the review determination. The Compact's regional office affirmed it. He requested a secondary assessment from a different team of relocation specialists. They also declined to proceed, citing the territorial claim. He filed an objection to the territorial claim itself, arguing that the anchor individual had vacated the territory and that continuous anchor presence was required for the covenant to hold. The Compact's territorial surveyor, Ossel, who was assigned to review the objection, spent 4 days at Vethkar. He reviewed the pack's behavior in person, which I understand required him to spend a full evening at the perimeter observation station watching the threshold watch formation hold position for 40 minutes, after which he wrote in his field notes that the pack's behavioral discipline was, and I am quoting from documentation he later shared with me, among the most precisely maintained anchor covenant expressions I have observed in 15 years of Kessari territorial review. He also reviewed the evidentiary record. The evidentiary record included, among other things, the station's perimeter camera footage from the past 23 months, which documented 412 consecutive evenings of pack occupancy at the east fence line, including the 263 evenings following my departure, during which the pack had been present at the fence line at dusk on every single night without exception. Same configuration, same positions, same 40-minute hold, every single night. Ossel's determination, which I have read in full and which is attached to this inquiry's documentation, states, and I am going to quote it directly because the language is clearer than anything I could produce, that continuous anchor presence is not a requirement for covenant validity under Article 14. The relevant criterion is demonstrated behavioral consistency by the pack, which constitutes the territorial claim in and of itself. The named anchor individual's absence from the territory does not dissolve the covenant. It reinforces it, as the pack's behavioral maintenance during the anchor's absence constitutes the strongest available evidence of covenant integrity. In plain language, the fact that they kept coming to the fence every evening while I was gone was counted as evidence that the covenant was real, not that it had lapsed. I will admit that when Draval forwarded me Ossel's determination, I sat with it for a long time. I was in my bunk on the outer corindle grid, a shift and a half into a long maintenance circuit, and I read it twice before I set my communicator down and stared at the ceiling of my quarters for a while. I found that I did not have an efficient reaction to it. It was not a simple thing to read about. 263 evenings. 263 evenings of an empty flat rock and an empty fence, and 4 animals taking their positions anyway and waiting for 40 minutes and then going back to the tree line. I tried to think of it as animal behavior, which it was. I tried to think of it as territorial instinct, which it also may have been. I found these framings less satisfying than I had expected. The section I found most difficult to set aside was the one titled Behavioral Record, Threshold Watch. I will summarize it. Ossel had reviewed the full perimeter camera record and had identified the consistent behavioral pattern in the pack, which he described as follows. Every evening, at approximately the same time, the pack would arrive at the east fence line. They would occupy positions consistent with a formal watch configuration, Von center and proximate to the fence, Thresh left, flank, Moret right, Suler at the treeline anchor position. They would remain in these positions for approximately 40 minutes. They would depart. The configuration, Ossel noted, was consistent with a Kessari pack behavioral practice documented in 3 other instances in the Compact's wildlife registry, all associated with established anchor covenants, and formally classified in the registry as threshold watch. He noted that the practice had apparently originated, in the Vethkar case, during the anchor individual's period of occupancy, and had been maintained continuously in the anchor individual's absence as a covenant-reinforcing behavior. I have looked up what threshold watch means in the Compact's wildlife registry. The definition given is approximately a Kessari behavioral designation for the deliberate recurring occupation of a territory boundary adjacent to the anchor individual's habitation. Space, performed at consistent intervals and held for the duration of the anchor individual's standard proximity period, as a declaration of continuous territorial covenant. There are 11 other documented cases in the registry. In 9 of them, the anchor individual was present during the behavior. In 2 of them, the anchor had died, and the packs maintained the behavior at the boundary of the anchor's former habitation space for the remainder of the observed period, which in one case was 12 years. I am not going to say what I thought about when I read that. I will say that I requested a transfer back to Vethkar Station at the earliest available opportunity, which was 8 weeks from the date I received Ossel's determination, and that I spent those 8 weeks finishing my contract obligations on the outer corindle grid with the particular focused efficiency of someone who has decided they are done and simply has to get through the remaining time. My circuit supervisor, a woman named Drev Castle, who had been running the grid for 11 years, and who I had come to respect substantially, asked me during my last shift briefing whether something had changed. I said yes. She said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Back to Vethkar." She said, "The resettlement outpost." I said yes. She said, "That seems like a strange place to go back to." I said, "There are people I need to see." She accepted this and did not ask further, which I found considerate. I arrived at Vethkar station on a Tuesday. It was late afternoon when the transit vehicle came through the main gate, and by the time I had processed my arrival and been assigned quarters, different building, same outpost, still a faint industrial smell in the air, though not boot oil this time. It was approaching dusk. Drevel met me at the processing desk. He looked older, which I suppose 8 months will do. He shook my hand and said, "Good to have you back." Then he said, "There's a situation at the East Gate." I asked what kind of situation. He said, "Administrator Harith filed a final objection to the territorial determination 3 weeks ago. The compact rejected it. He appealed to the regional council. They also rejected it. He has requested as a last procedural measure that the relocation team make one final attempt before the Article 14 covenant is formally entered into permanent registry." He paused. "They're out at the East Gate right now, have been since this morning." I asked how long that was. He said, "About 6 hours." I asked what the Kessari were doing. He said, "Vaughn is at the gate. The others are distributed along the fence line. The relocation team hasn't been able to get the gate open." He did not say this with alarm. He said it with the calm, factual quality of a man who has watched a situation develop across many months and has come to understand it better than most of the people currently involved in it. I put my bag down on the processing desk. I said, "I'll go sort it out." Drevel said, "I'll walk you over." The East Gate is about 300 meters from the main processing building, along a gravel path that runs behind the eastern housing modules. It was evening when I walked it, and the corundal dusk was in its first layer, the hard white going amber. I could see the gate from about 150 meters out. I could see the relocation team, 2 specialists in standardized wildlife management gear, standing well back from the gate. I could see Administrator Harith beside them, compact man in station administrative uniform, holding a document folder against his chest with both hands. I could see 3 of Harith's security officers standing further back again. 2 of them were watching the gate. One of them was watching his own feet, in the deliberate way people watch their feet when they do not want to watch the thing they are actually thinking about. What I could also see from 150 meters was that Vaughn was at the gate. I do not know how to describe what Vaughn looked like in a way that communicates it properly without exaggeration, but I will try. He was larger than a military utility vehicle. Not in height alone, but in the full 3 dimensions of him, the breadth of his shoulders, the width of his paw pads on the ground, the depth of his chest when he breathed. His fur had come in fully, the dark slate gray with the spinal stripe. His pale amber eyes had the quality I had noticed even when he was subadult, the quality of a thing that has already made all the decisions it intends to make and is simply waiting for events to confirm them. He was sitting at the gate in the same easy posture he had always used, haunches settled, breathing unhurried, looking at the relocation team and the security officers and his Administrator Harith with the profound, implacable indifference of an animal that does not find humans frightening, in the way humans are accustomed to being found frightening. He was not threatening them. He was not charging, or snarling, or performing any of the behaviors that the wildlife management specialists were, presumably trained to respond to. He was simply sitting at the gate in the position he had occupied every evening for the past 23 months, and the gate happened to be between him and the east perimeter cleared zone, and he had not moved and he was not going to move, and the 6 people 20 meters away from him had correctly identified that the gate was not going to open while he was there, and had spent 6 hours arriving at no workable alternative. Thresh was at the left fence line about 40 meters down. Merritt was at the right, the same distance. Suler was at the tree line. The configuration was, I recognized, exactly the threshold watch formation as described in Ossel's determination. They had been holding it for 6 hours, the same positions, the same spacing, the same patient stillness they had held for 40 minutes every evening for 2 years. The difference was that tonight someone had put a procedural problem between the watch and its object, and the pack had simply held the watch and waited for the problem to resolve itself. Administrator Harith saw me coming when I was about 50 meters out. He turned and walked toward me with the focused purpose of someone who has a great deal of documentation ready to deploy, he said. Mr. Severin, I am glad you've arrived. I want to be clear that the station's liability exposure in this situation is significant, and that the compact's determination, while final in form, is being pursued through, I said. I'll take care of it. He stopped walking. He said, the relocation specialists have been unable to, I said. I know. I'll take care of it. I walked past him. He fell silent, which I think was as much surprise as anything else. I walked up to the east gate. Vaughn watched me come. At about 5 meters, his posture changed, not alarm, not threat, but the particular ease and attention shift I had seen from sub-adults all those months ago, the shift that means a thing has stopped measuring and started recognizing. His head came up. Something in the set of his shoulders changed. His amber eyes, which had been resting on the relocation team with the same quality as a wall rests, shifted to me and became a different thing entirely. I stopped at the gate. He was on the outside of it. I was on the inside. The chain link between us. He was close enough that I could feel the warmth of him through the fence. I said, "Evening, Vaughn." He put his nose to the chain link. I put my hand there too. His breath was warm. He smelled the same. Earth and mineral and something faintly like the corindal air, the clean cold of it. He held there for a moment, pressing gently against the fence, and then he backed off and sat down in the open ground in front of the gate with the easy, complete relaxation of something that has been waiting a long time and has finally received the thing it was waiting for. I opened the gate and walked out. This produced a reaction from the assembled group that Dreval later described as significant. I am told that the 2 relocation specialists both stepped back, that one of them placed a hand on Dreval's arm, and that Administrator Harith made a sound that Dreval could not precisely characterize but described as involuntary. I was not aware of any of this because I was not watching them. I walked to my flat rock. It was still there, the same broad piece of native stone at the edge of the cleared zone. A little weathered from 2 years of corindal freeze-thaw, but solid. I sat down. Vaughn settled to my left. Thresh came in from the fence line and took her position to my right, running her directional scans with the same deliberate 2-point check she had always performed, and then settling. Merritt came and sat facing me with the familiar head tilt, the skeptical attentive quality that had not changed at all. Suler moved up from the tree line, closer than he had ever come when I was here before, about 10 meters behind me rather than 60, and settled there and made the low chest resonant sound that meant he was present, and everything was. In order I watched the corindal dusk do what it does. Hard white to amber, amber to the deep greenish gray, then dark, and the stars coming out in sequence, the 3 visible outer reach clusters of stars first and then the full spread of them. I sat there for 40 minutes. Behind me at the gate, Administrator Harith's relocation team and security detail waited. I did not know at the time that they were still there. I thought they had left. I was not thinking about them. I was thinking about nothing in particular, which is the entire point, which is the thing I had been doing on this flat rock for 9 months 2 years ago, and which is all I had ever been doing. Dreval told me afterward what had happened during those 40 minutes. Harith had made 2 attempts to approach the gate with the intention of entering the cleared zone and speaking to me directly. The first time Vaughn had turned his head and looked at him. Just looked. Harith had assessed the situation and decided not to proceed through the open gate. The second time, Harith had taken 2 steps toward the gate, and Vaughn had turned his head again, and Thresh had turned hers from the right flank, and Merritt had turned from the left, and all 3 of them had looked at Administrator Harith at the same time with the same quality of attention, and Harith had decided that the thing he needed to say to me could wait until morning. He had not been charged. He had not been threatened. No one had been harmed or come close to being harmed. The Kessari had simply looked at a man who was about to do something they had a strong opinion about, and the man had read the opinion correctly and reconsidered. Dreval found this in his words clarifying. After 40 minutes I got up. I said, "Good night" to the 4 of them, which I acknowledged was exactly as absurd as it had always been, and I cannot seem to stop doing it, and walked back to the gate. Harith was still there. He had the document folder in both hands. He said, "Mr. Severin, I need to speak with you about the station's position on," I said. "The station's position is that the compact's determination stands. That's what I understand from the documentation," he said. "The relocation order was," I said, "rejected at regional council level." "Yes." I read the file. I went through the gate and latched it behind me. "Is there something else I can help you with tonight?" There was a long pause. One of the security officers had turned his attention back to the middle distance, the practiced look of someone who has decided they are going to be professionally somewhere else in this conversation. Harith said, "The pack's behavior during the past 6 hours," I said. "The pack's behavior is on file with the Compact's territorial registry. Ossel's determination is attached." Picked up my bag, which Drevel had carried out for me. "I've got a full structural survey day starting at 6 tomorrow, so I'm going to turn in." "Good night, Administrator." He did not say anything else. I walked back down the gravel path with Drival, who did not say anything either for the first 100 meters, and then said, "Harith is going to file a formal protest with this inquiry board." I said, "That's his right." Drevel said, "The board convenes in 3 weeks." I said, "I'll be there." I looked back toward the east fence line. The threshold watch configuration was still holding at the gate. I could see the shapes of them in the early dark, Von and Thresh and Moret at their stations, Suler close behind. "Do they do this every night, still?" Dreval said, "Every night. Dusk, 40 minutes, same configuration, same positions, same as they always did." He paused. "More or less unchanged since you left." I did not say anything to that for a while. I looked at the dark where the Kessari were, and I thought about what it meant. Holding a watch at an empty gate for 2 years in the cold Corndal evenings, holding the same positions for the same 40 minutes, night after night, in all the weather the Corndal corridor produces, which is varied and sometimes severe. I thought about what it costs to do something like that, and then I thought that cost is maybe not the right word for an animal that does not calculate cost the way we do, for which the doing of the thing is simply the expression of what it is, and the not doing of it would be the more difficult choice. I did not find a good answer. I am not sure there is one. I want to say something about Administrator Herath before I finish, because I understand this inquiry involves his formal complaint, and I want to be accurate about my view of him. He was not wrong to be concerned about the Kessari. That is the thing I want the board to understand. A Kessari pack of 4 adults, Von especially at his full size, but the others as well, is a legitimate management concern for a resettlement outpost receiving civilians who have no prior experience with large territorial predators. Their size alone requires a specific kind of acclimation from people who are not expecting it. Their territorial behavior is complex, their capacity for damage is not in question, and the fact that they had adopted a nightly formation posture at the perimeter of a civilian station with 400 and growing residents was, from a security administration perspective, a genuinely difficult situation to manage. Harith did what he was trained to do. He escalated through the correct channels. He filed the appropriate assessments. He used the procedural options available to him. He was a competent administrator trying to manage a problem that his training had not been designed. For he was also wrong about the specific situation, and I say this without satisfaction. The Kessari were not a threat to the station. They never had been, and they gave no indication that they intended to become one. The fact that they are very large, and that Von declined to move from the gate for 6 hours, and that 3 of them looked at Harith when he made a second approach. None of that constitutes a threat. It constitutes a boundary. The Kessari had drawn a boundary around a specific piece of ground and a specific evening practice, and a specific individual, and they were maintaining it with perfect consistency. And the situation Harith found himself in at the East Gate was the natural consequence of trying to put a procedural mechanism across a boundary that the Compact's own territorial provisions had recognized as legitimate. The boundary is still there. It will continue to be there. I will continue to go out to the flat rock every evening because I find it useful, and the Kessari will continue to hold the threshold watch configuration, because apparently that is the name for what we do, and the Compact's territorial registry will continue to document it, and Vethkar Station will continue to operate around it without difficulty in the same way that settlements operate around any number of natural features that were present before the settlement arrived. That is the situation as I understand it. I am not sure what the inquiry board intends to do about Herath's formal protest, and I trust that whatever decision is made will be consistent with the Compact's territorial provisions and with the documented behavioral record. My only material interest in the outcome is that whatever is decided does not require me to stop going out to the flat rock in the evening. I have found the arrangement useful for nearly 3 years now, I believe, based on the available evidence that the Kessari have too. One more thing, and then I am done. I was back at the east fence line the evening after the gate incident. It was my second evening at Vethkar since returning. And the dusk was the standard Corndall dusk, unremarkable, cold at the edges, doing what it always does. I had my flat rock. All 4 of them were there in their positions, exactly as I had left them the night before, exactly as Ossel's camera record described, exactly as they had apparently been every night for 2 years. Vaughn settled to my left, Thresh to my right with her directional check, Merritt with the head tilt, Suler at 10 meters behind me, the closest position he had taken. I sat. The light went in layers. The 3 outer reach cluster stars came out. At some point during the 40 minutes, Vaughn put his head down on his paws and let out a long, slow breath. It was the sound of a very large, very tired, entirely relaxed animal that has finally gotten the thing it was waiting for. The sound of something that has been holding a position for a long time and has been allowed at last to set it down. I know what that sounds like. I have made the same sound myself, sitting on that rock, at the end of a long day, watching the Corondal sky go dark and the stars come out. I will answer any questions the board has. That is my full account.